On the 17th of August, 1942, 12 B-17, flying fortresses lumbered off a runway in England and crossed the Channel to bomb the marshalling yards at Rouen. It was a tiny beginning, a test of a theory that had never been tried in war: daylight precision bombing against a heavily defended industrial nation. The American commanders believed that a heavily armed bomber could fight its way to any target without fighter escort. To test that belief, they needed a target that mattered. 15 months later, they found it in the gray industrial city of Schweinfurt, 60 miles east of Frankfurt. In the summer of 1943, Schweinfurt produced nearly half of all the ball bearings made in Germany. A ball bearing is a simple thing, a polished steel sphere or roller that reduces friction in a machine. Without them, no tank could turn its turret, no airplane could run its engine, no submarine could dive. The entire German war machine depended on the steady flow of these small, precise components from the factories of Kugelfischer and VKF. Remove Schweinfurt, the strategists argued, and the German war economy would grind to a halt within months. On the morning of August 17, 1943, 376 B-17s went to prove that argument. One force struck the Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg and flew on to North Africa. The second turned northeast toward Schweinfurt. The Luftwaffe met them with every fighter it could scrape together. By the end of that day, 60 American bombers were gone, and 600 men were dead or missing. But the bombs that got through hit hard. At the Kugelfischer plant, 663 machines were destroyed or crippled. Production of ball bearings fell by more than half. In Berlin, Albert Speer, the Reich Minister for Armaments, warned Hitler that a few more raids would bring the war economy to a standstill. Yet the raid also revealed a terrible truth. Without long-range fighter escort, the bomber force could not sustain this pace. The Germans got the warning, and they had 4 months to prepare for the next blow. The question hanging over the 8th Air Force was whether they could ever deliver that blow without being destroyed first. At 7 o'clock on the morning of October 14, 1943, the briefing rooms across eastern England fell silent. The men of the 92nd Bomb Group sat on wooden benches under the harsh glare of lights, their heavy flight boots propped against the floor, their breath misting in the cold, damp air. A major stepped to the platform and pulled aside a black curtain, revealing a map of Europe with a length of black yarn stretching from England deep into southern Germany. "It's Schweinfurt," he said flatly. A voice from the back row cut through the murmur. "Son of a bitch, this is my last mission." Colonel Bud J. Peasley watched the faces around him, men who remembered August 17th, when 24 bombers failed to return from this same city. The intelligence officer explained that half of Germany's ball bearings came from Schweinfurt and that the mission had to succeed. Then Peasley stood and spoke to them directly, his language rough and unpolished, telling them to hold tight formation, to conserve ammunition, to move up when a comrade fell. He swore at them, and they laughed, and that laughter was the only break they would get that day. The men filed out into the wet gray dawn. They gathered in small clusters near the equipment huts, pulling on fleece-lined boots and leather jackets, checking oxygen masks and parachute harnesses. The chaplains moved among them, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, offering blessings that no man refused. At the hard stands, the ground crews had worked through the frozen night, patching battle damage from the last mission. They loaded 6,000-pound bombs into each fortress and topped the fuel tanks to the last drop. A mechanic chalked a note on the side of a bomb. "Greetings, you bastards." In the lead B-17, Captain James K. McLaughlin checked his instruments as Colonel Peasley climbed into the co-pilot's seat. Outside the cockpit window, a two-pronged green flare hissed into the misty air, sputtering against the low gray clouds. That green flare was the signal to start engines, and across England, 383 heavy bombers began to rumble to life, their propellers carving the fog into swirling ribbons of vapor. The takeoff was a gamble against the weather. Visibility stood at barely a quarter mile, and a light freezing drizzle slicked the runways. McLaughlin pressed the throttles forward, and the Fortress gathered speed through the murk, its wings straining for lift as the last runway lights blurred past. At 88 miles per hour, the roughness of the concrete fell away, and Peasley reached for the landing gear handle. The bomber climbed into a world of complete gray. No horizon, no sky, no earth. only the instruments glowing in front of them. At 6,500 feet, they burst through the overcast into brilliant sunlight, a vast white sea of clouds stretching in every direction. Behind them, bomber after bomber broke through the deck, assembling into formation over the radio beacons, but one group was missing. The 305th had taken off from Chelveston and simply vanished into the cloud layers, unable to find the rendezvous point. Peasley called for them on the radio. Nothing. He ordered a signal flare, fired every 20 seconds. Nothing. His formation of 42 bombers circled over the channel, waiting, and the minutes burned away fuel they could not spare. Peasley faced a brutal choice. Standard orders forbade any force of only two groups from penetrating German airspace. The risk of annihilation was too great. The 305th was nowhere in sight, and the French coast was drawing closer with each minute. He could abort the mission, waste the months of planning and the tons of fuel already burned, or he could break the rule. He switched on the radio and called the commander behind him. "I'm short one group," he said. "You will take over the lead, and I will fly high on you to bombs away." The formation cut a long curve over the channel, settling into an unorthodox but workable arrangement. Peasley had just violated standing procedure, and he knew it. He did not think of a court-martial. He thought of the 130 men in the missing group and wondered where they were. Far below, the coast of France slid into view. The mission was on, near Aachen. The P-47 Thunderbolts of the 353rd Fighter Group swung in from the flanks of the bomber stream. They had climbed through the same fog that plagued the bombers, 44 fighters finding each other by radio and instinct in the gray murk. The pilots spread into 3 squadrons, one above the fortresses, one to the right, one to the left. At 2 o'clock high, contrails appeared, 20-plus German fighters at 34,000 feet, dropping in fast. The 352nd Squadron broke hard into a climb, putting the sun at their backs, and let the Messerschmitts come down into their guns. 4 Me-109s exploded in the first pass. 4 more broke away trailing smoke. The Focke-Wulfs tried to split into a flanking attack, and the Thunderbolts met them in a diving turn that scattered the German formation. In 10 minutes of fighting, the P-47s destroyed 10 German fighters, probably destroyed another, and damaged 3 more. The bomber crews watched the distant specks spinning and burning and called out thanks over the open channel. Then the escort ran out of time and fuel. The Thunderbolts had to turn back or ditch in the channel, one by one. The P-47s peeled away, wagging their wings in farewell as they slipped into the west. Peasley pressed the button on his radio. "Thanks, little friends," he said. No one answered. The skies ahead of the bombers were suddenly very empty. Far behind them, the fighter pilots raced for home, their fuel gauges hovering near empty. The bombers still had 300 miles of German airspace to cross, through the Ruhrflak belt, past Frankfurt, and deep into Bavaria. The Luftwaffe had been waiting for this moment. All across Germany and France, fighters were climbing to altitude. The 353rd had thinned the enemy force by a handful, but the main weight of the German defense was still rising into the cold October sky, and the bombers were alone. Over the skies of Germany, the Luftwaffe struck with a coordinated fury that no American bomber force had ever faced. As the P-47 Thunderbolts turned back at Aachen, the German fighter controllers vectored every available squadron into the path of the unescorted bomber stream. The first wave of attacks came from dead ahead, with Messerschmitt Me-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190Os screaming through the formation at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Their wings and noses blazed with cannon fire, and behind them came the twin-engine Me-110Os and Ju-88s, holding off at 800 yards to launch salvos of rockets into the massed bombers. The rocket attacks were devastating. A projectile the size of a small bomb would streak into a formation, trailing a brilliant red flame and explode with a flash 4 times larger than an 88mm flak burst. Any B-17 caught directly by such a strike simply disintegrated in midair, scattering debris and bodies across the sky. Peasley watched one bomber ahead of him absorb a rocket directly into the right-wing root. The wing folded upward, the fuselage split open like an eggshell, and the shattered wreck disappeared beneath his left wing in a matter of seconds. Within the first 30 minutes, Peasley's formation of 21 bombers had been reduced to 14. Despite the slaughter, The bomber stream held its course at the initial point. 20 miles southwest of Schweinfurt, the lead bombardiers took control of the automatic flight equipment, and the formations wheeled on to their final heading. The flak over the target was the most intense any of the crews had ever seen. The Germans had massed batteries of 88mm guns, and the sky above Schweinfurt turned black with bursting steel. Peaslee described it as flak you could walk on, so thick that the aircraft seemed to be plowing through a solid field of smoke and flame. At 14:39 hours, the first bombs tumbled from the lead formations. Over the next 18 minutes, 228 flying fortresses dropped 395 tons of high explosives and 88 tons of incendiaries onto the ball-bearing plants of Schweinfurt. The Kugelfischer works took the heaviest punishment, losing 374 machines destroyed or damaged. The VKF works 1 and 2 were struck by dozens of bombs, and fires erupted across the factory grounds. One bombardier later reported seeing a great splash of fire right in the center of everything, with the smoke rising in a column visible for 50 miles. Peaslee watched the ground below as the bomb strings walked through the target. He thought of what the people of that city would face that night. No windows in any home, and the cold winter winds blowing unchecked through every room. One such victim was Brennan's Circus, piloted by Joseph Brennan. Fighter shot out his first engine over the target, and as he dove out of formation, cannon shells and machine gun fire shredded the wings and knocked out a second engine. Brennan dove the crippled fortress to the deck and hedge-hopped across the Netherlands at treetop level, with fighters still snapping at his tail. By the time he reached the channel, only one engine remained running, and the plane could not climb. Brennan ditched her in the sea, and the crew was pulled from the water by British rescue boats without a single injury. Another stricken fortress, the Paper Doll, lost its pilot to a cannon shell that nearly tore him in half. The navigator, Miles McFadden, took the controls with no training beyond straight and level flight. The co-pilot, Edward Downes, was severely wounded in both legs and his right arm, but he held his hands on the controls beside McFadden and nodded or shook his head to signal throttle adjustments. They brought the airplane down at a Royal Canadian Air Force field with no further casualties. When the ground crew counted the holes in the fuselage, they stopped at 132. The cost of mission 115 was staggering. Of the 383 bombers that took off from England, only 228 reached the target. 65 flying fortresses were lost, 60 shot down over Europe, and 5 that crashed or were abandoned over England. 594 crewmen were listed as missing. In the bombers that returned, 5 men lay dead and another 43 were wounded. The 8th Air Force had struck its most important target of the war, but the price in men and machines was beyond anything the command had ever imagined. As the surviving crews stumbled into their debriefing rooms that night, they carried with them the knowledge that the battle for the skies over Germany was far from over. 4 days after the battered fortresses limped home, Brigadier General F.L. Anderson peered at the aerial reconnaissance photographs spread across his desk. The images showed bomb craters clustered around the Kugelfischer and VKF plants, with smoke still rising from shattered factory buildings. He announced to the press that the Schweinfurt ball-bearing works were effectively destroyed, their entire production now inactive. General Henry H. Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, went further, telling reporters that this was the most perfect example of accurate bombing in history, and that the Army Air Forces had finally gotten Schweinfurt. Behind this public confidence, a different reality was already taking shape. In Berlin, Albert Speer had set in motion a massive effort to disperse the ball-bearing industry across 60 different locations throughout the Reich. The 4-month pause before the next American raid gave his engineers exactly what they needed: time to move machinery into bomb-proof basements, rebuild production lines in hidden workshops, and stockpile critical components. German industrial resilience was about to prove far greater than Allied planners had ever believed possible. When the 8th Air Force finally returned to Schweinfurt on February 25, 1944, the force was overwhelming. 600 bombers escorted by long-range fighters that could now fly all the way to the target and back. Over 2 days and nights, 3,000 tons of high explosives and incendiaries pounded the city. But the Germans had used the intervening months well. More than 40% of the machine tools that had once stood in Schweinfurt's factories were already gone, relocated to small towns and hidden assembly lines across the country. The bombing was heavy, and the damage visible from the air was extensive. but the effect on production was less severe than the October raid. The dispersal had worked. German engineers had discovered that machine tools were far more resilient than anyone had predicted. Even badly damaged buildings could be patched and returned to service within weeks. The February attack, despite its size, produced less actual damage to ball-bearing output than the far smaller mission of October 14th. After the war, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined the Schweinfurt campaign with painstaking detail. Their conclusion was sobering. Despite the courage and the sacrifice of the bomber crews, the ball-bearing industry had never been crippled. German production recovered to full pre-raid levels by September 1944, and not a single German weapon was ever held up for lack of bearings. The boast the Germans made at war's end was the truth. No equipment had been delayed because bearings were missing. The failure was not in the bombing itself. The accuracy of October 14th had been extraordinary and the damage real. The failure lay in the inability to follow up. The terrible losses of Black Thursday, 65 bombers and nearly 600 men in a single day, had left the 8th Air Force unable to return for 4 months. That interval was all the Germans needed. Albert Speer stated plainly what the survey confirmed. Repeated attacks every 14 days would have collapsed the war economy, but 8th Air Force could not sustain that pace. The men who flew Mission 115 never knew the final analysis of the bombing survey. They knew only that they had held formation over a burning city and brought what remained of their squadrons home. Captain James K. McLaughlin, who held the controls of the lead bomber throughout the ordeal, survived the war and returned to the United States. Joseph Brennan and every member of his crew survived the harrowing ditching in the Channel and lived through the war. Navigator Miles McFadden and the wounded co-pilot, Edward F. Downs, both survived the war. Their desperate flight home, a testament to the fortitude of the bomber crews. Colonel Peasley survived the war and returned to the United States. General F. L. Anderson continued his service. Albert Speer served 20 years in Spandau. But the final lesson of Black Thursday belongs not to the planners in Washington or Berlin. It belongs to the 10 men in each flying fortress who proved that no American force, once committed to battle, would ever turn back. If you have any family stories from the Schweinfurt raids or the bomber war over Europe, we would be honored to read them in the comments below. Please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. Your support helps us continue telling these important stories. Thank you for listening and for remembering.